Hello, this is Laren with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today I'm going to go over some DM prep, setup, organization, and some of the things that you'll want to know or learn as you first start running games or campaigns in the Fantasy Grounds Unity platform. So first things first is I've launched the software. On the very top left corner is your log, and then there's also a folder that goes into the back end of Fantasy Grounds where all the directories are. And that's also where you can add your own tokens, your own maps, your own assets to make maps, and also third-party modules. All of the official modules that come from the Fantasy Grounds store generally are vault or encrypted files so that you can't open those up, but the third-party stuff would be like things from the DM's Guild or things that you're creating yourself. The next thing is you have to sign into the software. So in the settings, you'll go into the settings area and you will notice that here is where you would put your username. You have your password. That will also be the same as the Fantasy Grounds forum. So before you even get started with Fantasy Grounds, you want to set up an account there and then go ahead and log in. And then once you've done that, if you get a license key later on, you decide you want to invest in it, you would put your license key in there and then you would hit save. The other thing you can do here is to scale the UI, which is the user interface. So at default, it's not too bad, but when you have a lot of content and you have a lot of windows, it makes viewing Fantasy Grounds a little bit more difficult. There is no way to break out the windows or to make them separate. They're all kind of self-contained. You can stretch the interface between different monitors, but it's not truly having a breakout system. They haven't got to that point yet. But nonetheless, you have the application scale. Put your license key in, your username, and then your password for the forums. That's what those two are. Once you've done that, you're going to hit save. And then if you haven't updated yet, this would be a good time to do that. So you can kind of force the update. That way, if it pulls in any new changes or anything that's occurred, or if you're somebody who subscribes to items or you've purchased some items on the Fantasy Grounds Forge, it'll also update those. Those don't give you notifications. Generally, they'll just update when you update your regular Fantasy Grounds. Usually every Tuesday or Wednesday-ish, they have some updates coming out from Smiteworks, from the official software. So you'll see revisions, often weekly, but then maybe once a month or once every couple months, you'll see a big update too. Fantasy Grounds is going through a lot of changes right now. They're adding audio integration and the fancy dice. They just added a couple other cool things. So it's moving along. It's just maybe not as fast as some people would want, but it's pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Launch Fantasy Grounds. And that will help you get back or return to the main screen. And once you're there, I'm going to go ahead and make this full screen. I have this little yellow pointer so you know where I'm clicking at. But once you are logged in and such, you want to look at the lobby status over here on the top left. It says connected. So that just means that the Fantasy Grounds server that allows you to connect to other users is up. There's a couple different ways to connect. We'll cover that in a bit, but that's just so you know the lobby's working. Your username's on the left. On your right is the status of your license. So maybe you have a demo or a standard version, but nonetheless, that's what that is. Now, when you're going to start a new campaign or a new session, it's really just an iteration or just like a session within Fantasy Grounds. Doesn't necessarily have to be a game. If you've already joined a game, you would click on Join Campaign as a player. But if you're the GM, you have to create a new campaign if you've never done it before. So you want to click that on the left. And now you have to give it a name. So what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to lead this with DnD5e because that's the rule set that I'm going to select down here in the game systems. And as you can see, there's a plethora of different rule sets. Some won't show up here until you actually buy the rule set because some of them are independent. They're not based on the core rule set. So DnD5e, and then I'm going to put DM, GM tips, I guess, or something like that. And then that's way when I go to look for this folder in the back end, I'll know that what rule set it's for. That's why I lead it with the rule set first. Or you can call this, test version or whatever you want to call it. But always make yourself kind of a blanket campaign that you use all the time for yourself to check out new product or to check out plugins or something new. That way you don't break your campaign or ruin it or mess it up too much. You're probably not going to hurt it, but it's nice to have a separate session for testing these things and not actually in the middle of a game or while you're prepping. You don't want to test a bunch of stuff in your campaign if you can help it. It's just a better practice not to do that. Okay, so over here on the right, you get to choose whether or not you want your server or your instance of Fantasy Grounds to be publicly displayed on the cloud. Now, the cloud is only for hosting the handshaking and the connectivity settings. It does not do anything with your files. So it does not store your campaign. Your campaign is actually hosted on your computer. The cloud just facilitates the ability to allow people to connect easier without using a direct connect. Otherwise, you'd use port 1802, use a LAN connection, and then you'd have to give out your IP address, and then you'd also have to do port forwarding on your computer. So Fantasy Grounds decided not to use that methodology. They decided to use this cloud connection. It works quite well. I mean, it has problems once in a while, but it's not too bad. The other thing is if you have a IP version 6 IP address and you're like in a newer country that's just getting the infrastructure, that doesn't work with port forwarding. So that's another reason why Fantasy Grounds went with this new cloud connection. There's people with IP version 6, they have to use VPNs and stuff like that, and it can get pretty complex. So I'm going to set my password no pass, and then I'm going to make it private. So if you make it private while you're connected to the cloud, it means that you can still host through the cloud, but it's not visible in the lobby list. And then if you go to LAN, your instance isn't going to be available on the cloud at all. So in the extensions area, I have quite a few extensions that I subscribe to. I can only honestly recommend 2. One of them is just a font, which will make the font in the chat window a little bit more visible. So I'll enable that because you have to enable these before you start your session. Otherwise, you have to start back over and go back down and redo it. So now that I have that one, if anything else, I don't really recommend, only because if you're new to Fantasy Grounds, it is very difficult to understand how the base vanilla program works without adding those complications and those variations in there. Now, when you get a little bit more familiar, it's much easier. It makes more sense. But if something breaks or you're not sure if it's calculating correctly and all that stuff, I would avoid using extensions, at least for the first couple months until you really get the hang of Fantasy Grounds. That's only a suggestion. You can go get what you want, but I would recommend spending some time in the base program before you start messing around with themes, or not themes, but extensions. Now, some of these extensions are okay. They're just like these themes. Some of these come with Fantasy Grounds. A few of these are paid. There are some other utility ones that work really well, depending on what you want and for quality of life. So some of these are not even really necessary. I don't think any of them are, to be honest, but there are some things that make life easier when you are using Fantasy Grounds, but until you get a handle on the base program, I would try to avoid those, at least for the first month or so. Once you get the hang of it and you understand how it works in its normal state, then when you add things to it, you'll understand it more, and you'll also know how, what's going on, and you'll be able to troubleshoot a little better. But if you ever run into any problems and you have a lot of extensions installed, the first thing you want to do is disable those systematically and find out which one's causing it. quite often the author hasn't gotten around to fixing it. So when you download extensions or you subscribe to them from the Forge, they'll update, but it may take them a couple days, because when Fantasy Grounds updates, it may affect that particular extension, and you have to wait till the author updates. So that's one other thing of kind of a word of caution, is that if you're patient and you know what's going on, go ahead and use them. But if not, it's going to make things really confusing and frustrating. One thing that I've learned over the years is to rely on an extension and then just have it not work all of a sudden forever is a kind of a pain in the butt, because you get used to playing a certain way, and then all of a sudden when you're faced with doing things manually or doing things on the fly and you don't have your extensions, you don't know how to do it, or you forget. So that's just kind of a word of caution. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the start button. So I've named the campaign, I have the rule set, I've set up the networking, and then any extensions that I'm going to load, I would select those now. I'm going to go ahead and hit start. While I'm doing that, I just want to mention that Fantasy Grounds Academy is not the official Fantasy Grounds Smiteworks company. We're mainly just a fan-based community that supports the idea of helping people learn the complexities and learning the fun of using the platform. Fantasy Grounds has its faults. It's not perfect. There are no perfect solutions. I get a lot of people that say, oh, this platform's better or this one's that. It really depends on how you play, your play style, how much money you want to invest in time and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of factors in it, but nonetheless, I think Fantasy Grounds is a pretty good choice. One of the things I do appreciate about it is that I have access to my content regardless. So if Fantasy Grounds or Smiteworks went out of business today, I could still use the software and not have to worry about being connected or being online. And that's the one thing that I felt more secure about, because when I first started doing virtual tabletops, I really was concerned about that. I thought it would be kind of a waste if I wasn't able to get a hold of my content when I needed it. So that was one of the reasons I stuck with it. And the other thing is the customer service is really good. I mean, they're decent, they're fair, they don't seem to be trying to rip you off. A lot of people scoff at the starting price, but if you really know the community well enough, you'll know that these licenses go on sale. They give away licenses. They give away like a 3-month subscription for free. I mean, there's all kinds of promotional things, especially like around the holidays, around Black Friday, those sort of things. That's the time to get in and at least get the license. A lot of people says, well, I don't want to spend $150 on it. Well, it is what it is. Once you paid for the ultimate license at the 150 level, then you're done. You don't have to pay for it again. Or if you don't like that, you can subscribe to it, and you got different levels. So you got the demo account, which is pretty much just players need that, and then you have your regular $40 account, and then there's the 150, which is like you can host anybody. So anyways, this is typically what you're going to face when you first start Fantasy Grounds. You'll get this campaign setup window. Over here and to the right are your menu items. This actual sidebar is collapsible, so this little arrow down below at the bottom right allows you to narrow this down. So if you need a little extra room, if you got a map that's longer or whatever, that's helpful. The campaign setup window is basically just a shortcut to some of these menu options, and then it also has some routines that are those are some routines that you can run through. And it'll be a lot of, little extra help when you first start. If you don't want this window to start up again when you're playing on your next session, like when you actually start up, you can essentially take and uncheck this little box, and then when you come into Fantasy Grounds, it will not come up again unless you want it to. And then you'd have to go in the options and turn it back on. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the next button. Now here you have modules that you can load. You have the 5e SRD, which comes with Fantasy Grounds. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. So this comes with it for free. So even if you don't have any particular modules or content, you'll have the SRD, whether you have the paid license or not. The SRD is a system reference document. It's kind of like your basics. It's kind of what everything's built upon. This is a very core base of the 5e rule set. And then they also have a basic rules, which is a very pared down version of the player's handbook. You're very limited on character creation options with just the free content. So if you load the basic rules and the SRD and such, you can probably put together a Dwarven cleric, if I remember right. But other than that, you don't have any racial or class options and that sort of thing. So that's where your limitation is going to be character creation. However, if you want to experience Fantasy Grounds and not throw a bunch of money at it at first, do a month subscription and get the Lost Mine module if you're going to do DnD5e. So I'm going to type in Lost Mine in this library activation window. And here you would activate any content that you owned. So assuming that you purchased this Lost Mine module. Now this thing isn't that expensive. It's like between anywhere from 12 to 15 bucks. One thing that's nice about it, even though it's been played 50,000 times, it's really nice to kind of use it to get used to running games and kind of a platform to launch from. It's 5 pre-gen characters, so you don't have to have the player's handbook and such, unless you want to level up, of course. And then it also has all the maps, monsters, everything you need, so it's self-contained. So if you actually invested in Fantasy Grounds and you paid full price, you're probably looking at, I don't know, maybe 170 bucks or something like that. Maybe a little more, a little less. So it depends also on your local economy. But nonetheless, that's probably your biggest hurdle in the beginning is just, the investment. But like I said, you can get the subscription and just get this module and use it for a while. The only problem with that is if you don't have the player's handbook, you won't be able to create characters very easily. It would require that you learn how to use the platform and create your own content, which can be done, by the way, but it takes a little time to do it. So it's just up to you what you need. But this Lost Mine module is loaded down. So I'm going to go ahead and close the module activation window. But as you can see, these green ones, this means that it's shared to the players, that they have access to some of the content in the modules, so that's helpful. If you want to deactivate or activate, you would go ahead and check that. Now that would be only if it's like a character creation module. If it's an adventure or a setting or something, you don't share that normally with your players. I also have some other stuff that's related to Phandelver, but I'm not going to load those. But these are third-party products that I got on the DM's Guild and such. Very useful, but it's not necessary for this class. So I'm going to go ahead and close the module activation window. So that's your process of activating content that you've purchased or that you've built or that you've bought off the DM's Guild. So once you have the rules loaded and you're happy with that, then you had to hit next, and then you're faced with the options. We're not going to get too deep into that in this session, and it's just a lot of stuff to cover. So I'm going to go ahead and hit finish, and that takes you through the little setup wizard. And then over here on the right, like I said, is your options menu. So if you bring that back up, this is all the options. And then here is the setup. So if you want to go back to that setup window, you can do that from here. So it kind of acts like a loop. You can also change some settings with the combat tracker and that sort of thing, but I'm not going to go into that all the way. I just wanted to show you what the settings and options look like. So now I'm going to go ahead and open up the combat tracker and get my tabletop set up. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on this chat window, and there's a little lock where you can lock the position. So I'm going to go ahead and unlock that and just drag this over, kind of stretching it, so to speak, and do that from the bottom right corner. And then I'm just going to take my mouse and left-click and hold and drag, and then just kind of move this window where I want it to be. So that's a pretty good spot right there. And now the combat tracker is where you're going to be keeping track of all of your combat-related stuff, such as attack rolls and turn order, initiative, all those sort of things. So this is where I usually stretch this out, and I have this roughly about the same width of this window down here. I can't go any smaller on the combat tracker because there's a limitation as to how small I can make it. If I make it much smaller, it's going to be too hard to see all these options on the top. So there is a limitation on how much you can squeeze that down. The next thing is the dice tower. It's not on by default, but when you roll a d20, it automatically is a hidden roll based on the default settings in Fantasy Grounds. However, if you want to turn on the dice tower for your players so you can have them do hidden rolls so that no other players can see it, including themselves, you can go into the options, and there's two settings here that are kind of independent and related. So table dice tower, if I turn that on, that turns it on for the players, not for the GM. So I could still roll in this chat window and it'd still be a private roll no matter what. The players, however, if they drop their roll into the dice tower, it's going to make a secret roll where the players that are connected to the table will know that they've actually made a roll, but they won't know the result, nor will the person who rolled it. So it's kind of a way to keep immersion, to keep people from doing their, I guess you'd call it cheating, but it's not really cheating, I guess metagaming. And then also it kind of keeps the element of surprise and, you know, keeps the tension and drama. So that's a kind of a good way that you can use that to a good effect. And if you want to use the dice tower like the players, you have to turn on the option chat show GM rolls, which means that when you do a basic roll here, it's going to show you the result. So if I turn that on, you'll notice on the bottom right, the dice tower appears. And that's because now if I drop the dice roll in the chat, it's now visible no matter what. So I'm going to take the dice tower and move it over closer to the dice. Its default is this bottom right corner. So I'm going to right click, unlock it, and then left click and drag until where I have it in a spot where I want it. And this is generally where I'll put this. The setup that I'm doing is something I do every time I start a new session. It's just a good way, a good habit to get into. Once you have your dice tower placed and your chat window in position, you can right click and relock those so that they don't move on you. So now those are stationary. The combat tracker does not lock, so it's kind of free floating. You can move it wherever you want. Now, there's something in Fantasy Grounds I think that really bothers newer users, and it still bothers some of the veteran users, is whenever you open a new data type, regardless of what it is, it opens in the center. So that can be, if you're not prepared for an adventure, or you're not sure how Fantasy Grounds works, or you've never dealt with that, just remember that the first time that you open a window, it's always going to open in the center. So for example, if I go to my campaign and then I want to look at the maps and such, when I bring up the images thing, it's right smack dab in the center, no matter what. So that's the first thing that happens with any new window until you move it. So if I don't want images to show up there, I'm going to drag that over here and I'll place it where I want it to open up, not where it's going to stay right in the middle, which is more than likely going to be in the way. So when I close this now, and I go ahead and open that images banner again, it's going to open where you left it. So that's true of just about any data type or window. What I quite often will see is in the middle of gameplay, and I'm guilty of this too, is when I was learning this combat tracker, for instance. Let's say you wanted the space back here to put something. So what people will do is, instead of closing it, which is the proper way, or at least the more convenient way to do it, they'll drag it aside and move it and use the space, and then they'll close it. Well, if you close it there and you don't move it back, then when you open it again, it's going to be right in the way again. So the idea is to open up all the different window types that you're going to be using in your session. You're not going to know every single one, but you'll know most of them. And put them in a spot where they're not going to be in the way. So like this party sheet is something I'll use throughout the adventure or the campaign. So I want it to show up here. I don't want it in the middle. So when I close this and I go to open it again, nope, wrong window. So let me go to party sheet. Yep, so it opens where I left it. So that's important to know that. So get all your windows arranged. So that's kind of the point I'm trying to make, is that remember that they always end up in the center when you first open them. And if you leave them in a bad place or to cover something else, or maybe something else is going to cover that. That's where you're going to run into frustration. So make sure that once you open a window, you move it aside to where even if you accidentally open it, it's not going to cover your map or your character sheet. That's generally where a lot of people get pissed off about the interface, is that it can get a little frustrating if you don't know that. So just know that all new data windows open in the center. It's very helpful to know that. Once you understand that, it makes navigation a little bit easier. So now that the dice tower is where I want it and I have the option enabled, now if I want to roll any hidden rolls, I need to roll in the dice tower like my players. And that's going back to this dice tower thing. So now it's an option where I have hidden rolls and it's a tower roll. So nobody will see that roll. However, the players will know that I rolled a dice, but they won't know what the result was. So it's kind of up to you how you want to run that, but that's generally how I do it. I usually use a dice tower. I just kind of like to do it, and every once in a while I'll drop a 20 side in there just for the hell of it. Scare the players. They think that something's going on, but it's really not. Okay, so that's essentially the main parts of this setup, is to get your table laid out, to get the windows organized where you want them, and those sort of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do that, and then I'm going to show you a couple things that are important to this. So I'm going to go to the library. This is where the actual modules and your assets. So if you have any map packs or tokens and such, they'll be in your assets folder. But as far as modules go, this is going to show the library and what I have available in this session. So I have a ton of other books, but I've only opened up and allocated to these 4. So this is the Lost Mine Adventure, which essentially can be ran without anything else. It's pretty nice. I have the SRD bestiary in here, but I probably don't even need that. I have the SRD data in case I have any spells on the character sheets that need to parse. So if you don't have the source book open, you have the spell. The spell's still going to work, but you're not going to have the information regarding the spell. So if it's on your character sheet, it will still activate and such, but you'll have no description of how the spell works. You'll have to look it up. So that's one of the things about owning content for like player character creation. Adventures and such, technically you can buy those or you can enter them yourself. I mean, that's a lot easier. Rule books are a little bit harder to do, and they're a little bit more complicated. So if you're trying to be a cheapskate, or you can't afford to go out and buy everything, just get the player's handbook and maybe one module as an example. And if you own D&D Beyond or some other source, you can input all that yourself. It takes time though we make that sound nonchalant. It's a little bit of an undertaking, but it's definitely worth it once you understand how it works. So the Lost Mine, when I click on a book in the library, this is essentially my bookshelf, and these are my books. So if I click on these, it changes the view over here on the right. So I'm going to look at the Lost Mine of Phandelver module, and this one comes with pregens, as I mentioned earlier. Most modules do not. So this module, the Stranger Things starter set, the D&D Essentials starter set, and then I think the Stormwreck Island, when that comes out in October, is going to have pregens. But other than that, those are and there might be some on the DM's Guild, but for official content, there's really not too many modules that supply pregens, and that's simply because they assume that most people want to make their own. But when you have pregens like this, you can add them to your campaign. So if I go to the player window, this is where character creation is done, and this is where you manage your library of characters. I don't have anything right now, but if I click on these little green buttons, it's going to add those to be available in the campaign that I'm in. That way, if I get new players and I don't want to spend 3 hours making characters, I can just run them with these first level characters. The only caveat is that I can't update them, or I can't level them up. That's why you would need the player's handbook, or you'd have to build your own content. So that's a kind of a a difficult thing to do on the fly. If you're gonna enter the player's handbook by yourself, that's gonna take, probably take you a good month to do it, depending on how much time you have. And you have to get an understanding of how the formatting should be. But nonetheless, this is how you add characters if there are any pre-gens. Most likely you won't have any, but this one does. And then if you want to read and just kind of look at Fantasy Grounds as a library, you'll have this reference manual entry on most official content. Some of the DM's Guild content doesn't have a reference manual, although people are starting to build them, so it's getting better. So this is essentially the book or the box set. So if you right-click on the very bottom, it will take you through all the different pages, just like you would through a book. It's like turning pages. You can skip to the first chapter if you want. You click on that first encounter area. Use this like a book in a library. So if you're going to just use your laptop and have people sitting around a table, you could totally do that. And you don't have to use a combat tracker necessarily. You just use this for your context. Maybe use a map to keep track of where they are, but you don't have to use all the bells, balloons, and whistles. You can just use this as your library instead of carrying around a duffel bag with 100 pounds worth of books. So this is just a convenient way of looking at the content. And then on the very bottom left, you have a search window. So if you wanted to look up treasure or something like that, it's click treasure, and then it's going to list everything that has treasure mentioned in it. So you kind of have a mild search engine down here. And like I said, you can go back and forth. And what's really nice is, let's say you were preparing for an adventure and you stop here and you're like, okay, I'm not going to do any more work tonight. So you can actually pop this window out, which is straight out of this reference manual, and then you can take this this actual page and bookmark it. So if I left click and drag, I can put it in one of these hotkeys below. So tomorrow or whenever you get around to it next, you can go right back to where you were and then use the arrow keys without having to go dig through the interface to get back to where you started. So it's kind of a nice thing. This would make running games a lot easier because you got your dice, you got maps, you got, as the GM, aside from having people connect and all that automation and all that stuff, this is a really cool way to run Fantasy Grounds. And if you had a projector or really cool widescreen, you can create a different. You can connect to yourself essentially as a player and use that as your kind of like your guide for your maps and stuff for your players. So it's just a kind of a cool thing. And then you can play it offline too, which is nice. So you had a laptop and some batteries, like 2 or 3 batteries, and you went camping for a weekend, you could totally bring your whole library, just pre-print your character sheets and run an adventure while you're camping. And as long as you have power, you're good. You don't need internet. So that's a nice thing about Fantasy Grounds. So anyways, that's generally where you start with, when you're looking through the content. I wanted to show you a little bit about the, the interface more, but I don't want to make this video too long. So that's going to be the first part of this, and kind of break this up into pieces because I get yelled at all the time because my videos are too long. But nonetheless, I think that's as far as I'm going to go today. Got to keep this to a kind of a dull minimum so that people don't freak out. Oh, it's too long. So anyways, I'll do more of these. If you guys like this type of content, please leave me a message in the description on YouTube, or hit me up in our Discord or whatever. So let me know if this helps you, or if it sucks, or if we do too much of it or not enough. I don't know. But I do this over and over and over because there's always new people. So that's why we might repeat stuff